Hi, and welcome to our panel, Speculative Frictions, Restoring Imaginative Spaces with Youth. We're going to introduce ourselves, and then we're going to answer 3 questions about our work in conversation. So excited to have you guys listening in. I'm Karis Jones. I am affiliated with NYU, and I have taught middle school, high school, undergraduates and master's students. That's my teaching experience.
Thanks, Karis. I'm Scott Storm. I'm a doctoral student in English education at New York University. I'm also a high school English teacher at Harvest Collegiate High School in New York City. And I have been a high school English teacher for the last 13 years, 9 of which at Harvest Collegiate, the school I helped to co-found.
Hey everyone, my name is Alex Corbitt. I taught 7th grade literacy in New York City for 5 years, and I am now a doc student at Boston College studying curriculum and instruction.
Hi everyone, I am Stephanie Renee Toliver. I'm an assistant professor of literacy and secondary humanities at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I have taught the gamut of 9th and 10th grade from general honors, AP, and gifted English and reading. Well, not AP reading, but reading courses. And I've also taught undergraduate classes, master's classes, and doc classes.
All right, so our first question today is, what is your context and what is speculative about your work? So Scott and I have been doing our research at the same school. It's Scott's school, Harvest Collegiate. My context was a 12th grade English classroom that was designed around youth interests. Particularly, this class was called Fandom Kingdom. And the way the course was designed was the first unit, we studied youth-selected texts as like fandom texts, so that could be TV shows, movies, video games, any sort of text that students were interested in studying. The second unit, we looked at literary conversations as fandoms. And the last unit, which we called our fandom transformation unit, was really what was speculative about our work. We were thinking about how students could enter into fandom conversations in transformative ways.
Thanks, Karis. The school in which I teach at is an urban public high school that is unscreened, meaning that our students come from all over the city. It's an in-district public school, so not a magnet and not a charter. And all of our classes are untracked and taught with a special education teacher, so they're fully inclusive. And what's really exciting about this context is that we don't have sort of like 9th grade English, 10th grade English in the traditional scope and sequence, but rather students get to choose from a menu of English courses. The class that I'm talking about today is called Fantastic Worlds and Where to Find Them. And it's a class in which students invent their own fantasy worlds, and everyone writes their own fantasy novel. So very exciting. What's speculative about that is that students are creating worlds that sometimes really think about the problems of our world and kind of highlight those problems, and sometimes reimagine new critical utopias.
In my classroom setting, as a 7th grade teacher, we taught a unit. It was actually a pre-boxed unit on Edgar Allan Poe, and it came with kind of like this immersive clue mystery where the kids used the different texts, the Edgar Allan Poe text, to figure out which one of Edgar Allan Poe's characters murdered Edgar Allan Poe. And that was kind of a staple of my curriculum for 5 years in 7th grade. But as I started reading more critical works about speculative fiction and the horror genre, including Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's new book, The Dark Fantastic, I started kind of problematizing the horror genre and kind of thinking through how it reifies racist, sexist, heteronormative values. So that kind of has been informing my subsequent work with youth and my research.
So my context was within a library space, and it took place in what I call the harbor for my pseudonym. And it is a creative writing program that's whole goal is to help youth to like pull on their histories, pull on their communities, pull on themselves to write stories. And one of the things that they noticed was that they didn't really have, like, everything they were doing were like poetry and realistic fiction. And so they had a student who refused to write any of it. And so they had like called me and they're like, hey, this kid does not want to write like anything that we're suggesting. He wants to write a fantasy story. Can you like help? And so I came in and I was working there. And then I had worked with them off and on for the course of like 3 years. And then I asked them, I was like, hey, I want to do my own workshop with Black girls to write speculative stories. And so they were like, finally, you finally asked us to do this. We've been waiting. So my research was really working with Black girls to write these stories. And so in the first 6 weeks out of the 8 weeks that we met on Saturdays and Sundays for like 4 hours each day. And so on the first 6 weeks, it was a modified writing workshop where we took like realistic fiction exercises and transformed them into like sci-fi and fantasy exercises and used those as like a foregrounding to the stories that they would eventually write. During the last 2 weeks, they just wrote and then we read them. And it wasn't like uninterrupted writing time that normally happens in writers' workshops. It was very interrupted time where like the girls would just be like, hey, does this character name make sense? Or can you read this to see if my world building is okay? Or I don't like this sentence, can y'all help me fix it? And so we did the writing workshop with all the different pieces of like the mini lesson and those conversations. And then we had uninterrupted writing time specifically for our stories. And so the stories that the girls wrote ran the gamut of speculative fiction, which is why I think it's important to highlight the speculative in general, because they wrote sci-fi stories, fantasy stories, horror stories, like the gamut of what speculative is. And so that is the speculative part of my work. Like I try to transform realistic fiction tools to highlight speculative fiction work. And so I think that's been really fun for me. And it's been really interesting to read what the girls write in their stories, because it's not just creative and playful, but they're also really drawing on their communities and their homes and themselves and putting those into speculative stories in ways that I think can push the field forward.
All right, so our next question is, how have you reimagined your teaching to center the speculative? So I think that something that really struck me in our context when we were thinking about how to make a class into a fandom kingdom, we had to kind of let go of the traditional model of us as teachers picking texts and saying, these are the texts that we're going to study. And actually, you can kind of think of an English classroom as a fandom where the teacher is the main fan, and they're trying to bring all of the students like in to like be a fan of this work and join this conversation. Instead, in our class, all of the students had their fandoms, and everyone was saying, come and be a fan and join my fandom and learn about this. So it really decentered us as teachers to let students bring in the things that they were excited about and the speculative stories that they were reading.
In the class about writing your own fantasy novel, there were a few key shifts that one had to make as an English teacher in this context. One is that you really want to uphold the kinds of creative work that students are doing. And so instead of having sort of a list of books that we would go through as a whole class, we would have a list of books that then students would say, okay, like let's all read this one together, or let's all read this one together. And you read for a very different purpose. For example, we read N.K. Jemison's work on the 5th season to think about how she was taking point of view and meshing that with fantastic elements, right? And so you read as a writer. And this was a really key part of what we did. Another key way that we shifted is that we every Friday had something called Novel Slam. Novel Slam is a lot like a poetry slam, in which every student gets to get up in front of the class. We sit in a large circle and read part of their novel. You can read a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter, whatever you want. And in the first few weeks, everyone just gives positive feedback, warm feedback, we call it, on the things that they love about your novel. Like, oh man, I love this character. I love the way that you had this little turn of phrase in there. That was so cool. And as time goes on and people get more comfortable as a community of writers together, you can add in more kind of cool feedback, constructive criticism, thinking about, something I want to hear more from you is about this character. Or, yeah, what's the relationship between this girl and her father? Like, how does that really work? And so really building that up together as a community was a key, so that it's not just people writing their own stories in this individual way, but rather you're creating a community of critical fantasy scholars together.
I'm connecting with what you mentioned, Scott, about reading as a writer. And in a 6-week unit that I worked with 8th grade students, we actually read some horror stories and kind of looked at them critically to kind of tease out horror tropes that we can kind of dismantle or problematize. And to help with that, we used Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas and Dr. Amy Storniola's Restorying framework to think about how can we take a text such as The Price by Neil Gaiman and rework it, as in bending the setting, bending the identities of the characters, bending the time period or the modality in ways that can center the stories that students want to tell. And so thinking about how is the story constructed in a way to kind of show a theme or a life lesson, and how can we kind of shift that to share our own experiences. And as we did that, we kind of interrogated notions of monstrosity and, you know, how is that framed and how can we reframe those ideas?
I'm also thinking about the idea of reading like a writer, and not necessarily reading just text, but reading the world. And like taking from Frere and just really thinking about how the the girls that were in the library space, like they were reading what's happening in the world while also reading like speculative text alongside the many lessons that we were doing. And one of the ways that I tried to like center the speculative was to focus on their realities first and then focus on the imagination. So like kind of borrowing from Virginia Hamilton, who's like, we make known and then we make the imagined. So for instance, one of the things that we did, I asked them to like find a storyteller, and that could have been like any storyteller. It could be family member. And I said family was broadly construed. So it doesn't have to necessarily be like a mom or a sister. It could be like anyone in the community that you consider a part of your family. And then I asked them to write down that story. And then to move to the imagine, I said, okay, so like revisit that family story and then find the gaps and fill them in with your imagination. So like what things can you put in there that didn't happen, but that could make that story even more robust? Another thing that we did after that activity, I said, like, based on the stories that they had gathered, like from their family, from the different stories that we had gathered over time, so what problems and issues do they see in their community or their worlds? And that was, of course, based on what's going on in the real world. And then I said, to move to the imagined, if we don't fix this problem, what could happen in 10 years? What could happen in 100 years? And so we're moving from what's happening currently to like what could possibly happen. So the what is to what could be. And so I do that a lot, where it's like I center what's happening right now and then find ways to bring in speculative elements in my teaching to really think through like what could new social justice imbued worlds look like? What could a world look like when they loved Black people? Like what does that look like and how can we imagine those things? And so I bring kind of like looking at what's happening, but finding new ways to think through what could be in the future or in a whole new world.
And then our last question for you guys today is, how does your work center equity and transformation? So in our context, something that we were always thinking about was analyzing discourses and thinking about larger fandom conversations. And in our class, we talked a lot about critical tools for analyzing power imbalances or ways that identities and viewpoints were being marginalized in fandom discourses, and students were particularly interested in toxicity and gatekeeping and ways that fandoms kept people out or certain stories out. And so our last project, we had students use these critical tools on fandoms that they love to identify like what's something that's problematic in your fandom that you would like to see changed. And then students would imagine what a more equitable fandom would look like, and they would create artifacts that could enter that fandom and help to push it toward justice. So we had students writing poems that like address toxic masculinity or students writing essays, like arguing for a more inclusive fandom, or students imagining like what would the office look like if it were less politically incorrect and more inclusive. So just students doing a lot of imagining about how their fandom could shift. And this was hard. It's often hard to critique these spaces that you love, but when students got into it, there were a lot of things that they could reimagine.
For us in Inventing Fantastic Worlds, one of the really exciting things about fantasy literature is that it's able to both draw on the kind of critical skills of critique and dismantling and questioning, but also draw on skills of imagination and rebuilding and creating new structures. And so this was something that we like always talked about in our class is what kind of fantastic or speculative writer do you want to be? Do you want to be someone who questions and breaks down and critiques and shows like how things could really go wrong if we continue on these oppressive paths? Or do you want to be someone who imagines a utopian future and what that might look like? And so for people in the former category, they drew on things like the Hunger Games to think about how districts are used, and also Handmaid's Tale to think about how people are stratified and how the reification of sexism might kind of happen 100, 250 years from now. And so we have a student wrote a whole essay that was a really dystopic look at a President Crump who was ruling over an American dictatorship at the time. And so it's really showing as a cautionary tale what can happen. Meanwhile, there were also students who rejected that premise and said, no, we like deal enough with the tragedy of our world today. Let's imagine a queer futurity that is a utopian world for queer people that doesn't have the kinds of homophobia that we face today. And so really reframing that, you know, and there we're drawing on a long tradition of fantasy writers like Ursula K. Le Guin, who thought about, okay, well, what would our world look like if gender was different in The Left Hand of Darkness? And so here, students were really thinking about, okay, here's this oppressive structure, and what if it didn't exist? And reframing that. And so at the end of the day, all the students wrote fantasy novels that were over 100 pages and presented them in our novel slam to our whole school community.
As the kids and I read through various short stories, horror short stories, we kind of thought about what are the assumptions that the horror genre makes about things like, for example, like the home invasion trope. What are assumptions about what is home or what counts as home, and how that kind of is centered around like white middle class suburban communities, and kind of problematizing that. Some students flipped the trope and thought about like, well, what happens not when, you know, things are coming into our homes, but we're kind of kept out of our homes, and what does that mean? And so thinking through kind of the tropes in that way, and then also thinking about kind of ideologies of the monstrous and how we might be able to kind of broaden that beyond monstrosity as embodied in people, but monstrosity in systems, systems of race and, you know, class struggle. And even some students thought about how certain emotions can be haunting, like feelings of loneliness. One girl she was haunted by texts from her own loneliness, and her text was kind of thinking through that experience. So as we did these critical reimaginings of the genre, some of those kind of interesting insights came out of the work.
Thank you for mentioning like that, those assumptions and that like this idea of monstrosity, because I feel like I center equity and transformation in my work by centering Black girls, because there's this assumption that Black girls don't read sci-fi, that Black girls don't read fantasy, that Black girls don't watch horror, that Black girls are not engaging in any of the speculative worlds that are created. And I think that's why it's such an anomaly when we see things like Watchmen or Lovecraft Country, because people are like in awe. They're like, oh my gosh, this exists. And I'm like, it's been here. We've been dreaming, we've been doing this, but there's this assumption that we haven't. And so I think that my work centers equity and justice by really thinking about like, what do Black girls dream about? Like, we know what they're fighting against. We know that they're fighting against racism. We know that they're fighting against misogynoir. We know that they're fighting against homophobia. They're fighting against transphobia. They're fighting against all of these different things, but what do they dream about? What do they want for their futures? And I think that's something that we don't center enough. And not just Black girls, but all kids of color. Like, we always focus on the negative things. We don't focus on their dreams. And I think that there's freedom in dreaming of futures and new worlds. And I think that that's part of how I try to center equity and transformation in transforming how we think about how kids of color dream. And I think it's equitable in thinking about the fact that, like, we have to start engaging in work that centers the joy of dreaming, not just the oppression of the present or the horrors of the past, but also the joys of the possible futures. And I think that that's the way that I try to center equity and transformation.
Thank you so much for listening to our panel. We'd love to hear from you. So feel free to tweet us or send us a message, and we'd love to hear about what you're doing in your classrooms.